How did a company founded in 1888, once synonymous with photography and innovation, a company that introduced cameras to the world and invented both the color film and the digital camera, end up filing for bankruptcy in 2012? This is the story of Kodak. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, and you're listening to our fourth episode of the third season of this weekly live video series called Centaur Stage. It is ingrained in human nature to love a good story, and in my years of experience and learning, I've collected a few of these stories from companies and leaders who've either succeeded brilliantly or failed tragically, and the lessons that we can learn from these stories. In this third season, we dive deep into tales of triumph and tragedy, sharing lessons learned from companies and leaders who face incredible challenges. Today, we look into how Kodak faltered in leveraging their own innovation and uncover the invaluable lessons we can learn from their critical missteps. Let us start at the beginning. In the late 19th century, George Eastman, a visionary entrepreneur and inventor, founded the Eastman Kodak Company. He wanted to make photography accessible to the masses. He really believed that if you could simply simplify the complex photographic process of the time, make it more user-friendly, that everyone would want to have a camera. One of his first major breakthroughs came in 1888. Yes, I'm so not used to saying that date. He introduced the Kodak camera. And the reason this camera was innovative was because it was the first handheld camera. It was easy to use. It didn't require you to have any technical knowledge. It came preloaded with a roll of film that could allow you to capture 100 photos. And once you were done, you would send the entire camera back to the company for film development, printing, and reloading. A year later, George Eastman continued to revolutionize the industry by introducing the first flexible roll of film. If you didn't know this, prior to the circular film rolls, in fact, photographs were taken on glass plates, and he's the one who invented that roll of film, making it more convenient and opening the possibilities for photographers. Just a year later, he introduced the Brownie camera, which was a low-cost camera designed for the general public. In 1935, they introduced Kodachrome, which became one of the most widely used color films for decades. In the mid-70s, Kodak had become so dominant that they practically pushed their competitors off the market. They had an 85% market share in cameras and a 90% market share in film. And in the mid-70s, to be precise, in 1975, Steven Sasson, a Kodak engineer, invented the first digital camera. Then nothing happened. For decades, this went unnoticed. Kodak continued to be incredibly successful throughout the 20th century. I think we all know the expression, a Kodak moment. It was such a ubiquitous brand. Everybody had a Kodak. And the company became a household name. Their approach and their business model was very simple and very effective. We sell affordable cameras to the masses for cheap, and we make substantial profits from the sale of related consumables, films, chemicals, photography, paper, printing. This is what you call a razor blade business model, which is where you sell an item at a low price or maybe even practically for free in order to increase the sales of a complementary product: camera, film, printer, ink, razor, and blades. And for many years, Kodak was the brand associated with capturing those memories. And the digital camera that Sasson had invented was a thing of the past, relegated to history. In fact, during the presentation that the lead engineer who casually invented the digital camera we use today gave of his invention to the executive team of Kodak, an executive asked, "Where do you put the film?" And Sasson replied that this digital camera was filmless photography. And management reacted by saying, "That's cute. Don't tell anyone about it." Kodak executive chose to ignore and then later on to mock digital photography, saying it was too expensive, not good enough quality. They would always cite the same example. You know, if someone's house catches fire, the first thing they rescue is their photographs. And so it was a few years later in the early 80s, Sony introduced the first digital camera to the market. And so Kodak management commissioned a report. They wanted to understand this new phenomenon called digital photography. The report came with both good and bad news. The bad news was that it predicted that eventually digital photography would dominate over film. The good news was that Kodak had about 10 years to figure this out. They had about 10 years to prepare for this technological shift, considering that for a while, this new technology called digital cameras would continue to be too expensive for, the everyday person to own. And surprisingly, here's what Kodak's management did. They took the opposite approach. Instead of trying to figure out how to enter the digital camera market, they focused on what they've always done, R&D and marketing efforts for traditional film-based photography, thinking that this digital thing was just a passing phase. It didn't have legs. It didn't have sustainability. Later, one of their CTOs would say, "It seems Kodak had developed antibodies against anything that might compete with film." And when digital photography took off in the early 90s, Kodak did finally attempt a diversification strategy. They invested in new areas of business like products from the pharmaceutical industry, digital cameras, an online photo sharing space called Ophoto, and digital printing services. To execute this strategy, they opened their wallets. They spent north of $10 billion acquiring medical companies specializing in pharmaceuticals, medical diagnostic tests, and equipment. These acquisitions were meant to help them grow, and in fact, medical sales were accounting for about a quarter of their annual revenue. But their focus remained on getting people to print pictures. That service, online photo sharing service I told you about, Ophoto, later, when Kodak ends up filing for bankruptcy, they sell it for $25 million, just a few years before Facebook actually spends $1 billion acquiring Instagram. But back to 2000. So we've gone through a century, we've gone through the decades, the 2000s kick off, and the year 2000 is actually the year where the number of photos preserved on film peaks at 85 billion. So from the perspective of a Kodak manager, up until year 2000, you were doing just fine. You kept selling more and more film. You kept making more and more money because film has incredibly high margin. The company was doing just great. I think at some point, Kodak had more than 140,000 employees. But as I said, that's the year that the number of photos preserved on film peaked at 85 billion. And where there is a peak, there is a pit. So what happened? Well, let's look inside Kodak. The first thing that happened is that on the surface, Kodak continued to espouse values of not just respect, integrity, trust, but also the values of its entrepreneurial founder around continuous improvement. At Kodak, "You matter" was their motto. They wanted to create an environment where employees felt valued and celebrated. They understood the importance of personal growth, new skill sets. They knew they were in a rapidly changing industry. But that was what was on the surface. Behind closed doors, the reality was very different. In truth, Kodak had become so successful that it was internally focused. It was overly fixated on the achievements of the past. John Cotter, who's a strategy and culture expert, upon looking into what had happened to the culture inside Kodak, described this as a culture of complacency. The company, its executives, its management, they'd become so used to generating a huge profit from one product, which was film, that they became victims of their own success. They figured, we don't want to make any manufacturing problems. We have great profitability. We want to just focus on being really good at this one product. We don't want to take risks. And so they avoided risky decisions and instead made sure that their policies, their procedures worked to maintain the status quo. For example, they famously passed on becoming the official film partner of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. And that opened the door to Fujifilm. Now, Fujifilm was kicking their ass back in Japan, but they were dominant in the US. And they were so used to being the big guys. Remember, 90% market share? They were so used to it that they didn't for a minute blink when they gave the seat to their main competitor. And Fujifilm came in and stole their market share because they had developed a film product that was 20% cheaper. At the same time, Kodak executives really suffered from this mentality of putting out perfect products. They had this belief that every product they released should be flawless, leaving no room for imperfections or errors. Rosabeth Moss-Kanter at Harvard Business Review contrasted this culture with the high-tech mindset of make it, launch it, fix it, that the changing industry demanded. You see, the environment within which Kodak was operating was changing so fast that the desire for excellence and perfection of the past was going to be a strategy that killed them, because what they needed to do more than anything else was iterate, learn, adapt, understand how their environment was changing and do something about it. It is true that the founder of the organization was an entrepreneur, and that spirit of innovation was there for many, many decades. But he was also very much a family guy, and he fostered a familial environment within the organization. Employees, their families, they were taken care of throughout their lives. They were very loyal, but everything was also very stable. And because Kodak had been commercially successful for so many years, everybody firmly believed that they were untouchable and that the future would mirror the prosperous past. They had grown accustomed to these big margins, and despite the clear evidence that that market, that, cash cow, the film industry, was going to change dramatically and diminish, even though they had 10 years to plan for it, they failed to allocate a significant portion of their investment to these new products and instead put all of their money behind the diminishing and declining products. They didn't invest in all of the patents. They didn't invest in all of the innovation that they were developing in the background. They never thought for a minute to look at creating competitive products with lower profit margins, even though there was growing demand for these digital alternatives. And even when they did manage to develop new products, because mind you, when Kodak went bankrupt, actually, they sold off their patents for millions of dollars. They had so many patents to their name, but they never took these patents and turned them into something that they could sell at scale. When they did find new products, they struggled to commit. They didn't put sales or strong market presence behind them. They didn't push for expanding the reach and adoption of these offerings. They just kept going back to their high profit margin. In addition to that, Kodak was organized with a conventional, functional organizational structure, sales and marketing, R&D, production. Each one of them operated distinctly, independently from the rest of the teams. And that meant that every group was just focused on their own agenda, focused on their own capabilities and their own desires and goals and objectives. And that created a significant obstacle to achieving the kind of alignment and collaboration and coordination needed when a new product or a new way to enter the market requires company-wide initiatives. Everybody was just concerned with safeguarding their own domain. That meant that communication and collaboration between units just wasn't there. And so any new plan, any new product wasn't adopted. Resources were duplicated, costs were high. It just didn't work out. And so you can see that, yes, certainly the market was shifting. Yes, they were going against very strong headwinds where what had been a stable source of revenue for them was going to be pulled out from under their legs. But it's not like they didn't know. It's not like they didn't understand what the timeline was. And it's not like they were lacking the ability to innovate. having invented the digital camera in the 70s. So when we try and understand what happened to Kodak, this isn't a story about customers changing behaviors or the market shifting. I think this is a story of how the company's structure, the cultural norms that had been established, and the incentives of the leadership removed the ability of the organization to have the agility and flexibility needed to navigate this shifting landscape. The story of Kodak also reminds me of the difference between invention and innovation. We often think that innovation means inventing new things, but actually, innovators, yes, they do take new inventions, but they iterate, they combine pre-existing ideas until they incrementally modify an invention. They turn it into something marketable, something that people want to buy, and they use inventions to innovate by creating successful companies or business models around these innovations. Here's a quote I like. Inventors seek the promise of the unknown, while innovators realize the promise of the known. As most scientists will attest, realizing the promise is more financially rewarding than seeking the promise. Kodak failed to innovate despite having a large number of inventions and patents to their name, not because their market changed, but because they created a culture and a structure that led their management to complacency, incentivized employees for the wrong thing, and created silos that hindered innovation and collaboration. I hope you enjoyed the story, and thank you for tuning in. We will be reposting the videos on our social pages, YouTube, and website. I'm Marilyn Zachauer, and you're listening to Centaur Stage Season 3, where I talk about the common challenges that leaders face and the stories of those who have faced them with triumph or tragedy. Next week, join me again as I tell you about the Southwest rise and fall from maverick to mishap.